I spent a year sewing her wedding dress. My daughter said, "I'm not wearing that rag from your rotting shack." The first thing I saw when I stepped into that room was my daughter's heel grinding into the lace of the wedding gown I had spent a year making. The dress lay crumpled on the carpet like something discarded in an alley, a pale spill of fabric with one long thread curling away from it. Evelyn's hand was still in mid-air from where she had flung it down, her manicured fingers opening as if she were ridding herself of something dirty. The sound of the box hitting the floor was still ringing in my ears, that sharp, hollow thud, followed by the whisper of silk sliding free. She pressed her weight onto the shoe, twisting it just enough to snag the lace. "I'm not wearing that rag from your rotting shack, Mom," she said without even glancing at me. "I'm getting married, not going to a thrift store costume party." Derek, lounging in a velvet chair beside her, didn't miss a beat. "Pawn it, babe," he said, swirling the champagne in his glass like he owned the air in the room. "Might help her pay her heating bills." The bridesmaids burst into muffled laughter, exchanging little side glances, as if my humiliation were a party trick they'd been promised. One of them, her voice dripping with amusement, leaned toward the others and added, "She should be grateful she's even invited." I stood there for a moment, the door still half open behind me, my arms suddenly lighter without the weight of the box. I had imagined handing it to her in silence, watching her lift the lid, maybe even seeing some flicker of appreciation in her eyes. Instead, she had ripped it from my hands the second I stepped close enough, the box nearly tearing at the corners as she yanked it. She had not looked at me, not once, before letting it crash to the floor and pawing through it as if searching for proof it was as worthless as she already believed. The dress had been folded with care, inside the white silk scarf that belonged to my mother, a scarf that had once been draped over her own gown on the morning she married my father. That scarf had survived wars, moves, winters without heat, summers that baked the attic where it was stored. And now it lay wrinkled on the floor beside Evelyn's chair, the corner caught under the leg of a champagne table. I bent slowly, ignoring the burn in my knees, and lifted the gown from the carpet. My hands brushed over the bodice, feeling the snag where her heel had bitten into the fabric. That thread, fine, delicate, had been pulled loose, stretching toward the hem in a long, accusing line. I wrapped the dress back into the silk scarf, folding the torn lace inside as if to hide it from the eyes that had mocked it. The scarf smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, scents that had clung to it through decades. When I straightened, Evelyn was already leaning toward Derek, showing him something on her phone. They were laughing softly, the kind of laugh people use when they want you to know you are the joke. Her profile was sharp against the glow of the chandeliers, her chin tilted upward, like a woman who believed nothing in the room could touch her. I held her gaze for exactly 5 seconds when she finally glanced my way, a steady, unblinking look that neither pleaded nor accused. I let it rest on her face long enough for her to know I had memorized it. The slight curl of her lip, the glint of her earrings, the faint flush on her cheek from the wine. Then I turned toward the door. A young waiter stepped aside to let me pass, the tray in his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. His eyes moved from the bundle in my arms to my face, and in them I saw something no one else in that room had given me. Recognition. Not of the dress or the scarf, but of the fact that I was leaving with my dignity still intact. He shook his head once, slow and almost imperceptible, before looking down again. I walked out into the quieter hallway, the noise of the private room dimming behind me. My steps were soft on the thick carpet, but in my ears the sound of tearing lace stayed loud, looping over and over, as if the dress itself had sighed in resignation. I kept my arms tight around it, feeling the softness of the silk under my palms, the small weight of the fabric that had carried a year of my nights, my hopes, my patience. It was not heavy. Not really. What I carried out of that room weighed far more than cloth could. 15 years ago, the air in our kitchen was thick with the smell of tomato soup and the sound of Evelyn slamming her bedroom door. She had just come home from school with a glossy magazine, folded open to a full-page spread, of a prom dress, silk chiffon in a shade of deep blue that shimmered like water under lights. The price tag was more than I had made in a month at the diner, but that was not the reason I said no. That spring, her father was in and out of the hospital, his chest a battlefield of scars and machines. and every spare dollar we had went to keep him alive for one more season. I told her as gently as I could that we could look for something beautiful but affordable, that I would even sew it myself if she wanted. Evelyn's eyes had gone flat in a way that chilled me, and she had whispered almost to herself, "You just do not want me to be happy." She carried that belief like a talisman, rubbing it smooth over the years until it became true in her own mind. By summer, she was telling friends that I had ruined her prom out of jealousy, that I wanted her to look cheap so no boy would want her. It was a small thing to the world, but to her it became the seed of every grievance. Years later, at a Thanksgiving dinner hosted by my sister, the seed sprouted in full view of the family. The table was set with the good china, the turkey steaming under golden skin, and laughter bouncing off the walls, until Evelyn's voice cut through. Someone had complimented her on a dress she was wearing, and without missing a beat she said, "Well, Mom never wanted me to be happy. She made sure of that when she destroyed my prom night." Forks paused halfway to mouths. My sister's husband gave a low whistle. The cousins glanced at me, waiting for my protest, but I was too stunned to speak. Evelyn sat back in her chair, swirling her wine as if she had simply stated a fact. From that night on, the story became family lore, told in hushed, knowing tones, always with a sympathetic glance in Evelyn's direction and a cool, dismissive one in mine. The double standards grew clearer when Derek entered the picture. Before they were even engaged, I heard about the time he had saved their future by selling a family heirloom, a gold pocket watch that had allegedly belonged to his grandfather. The truth, which I learned by accident, was that the watch was a cheap reproduction, pawned not to cover rent or groceries, but to pay off a gambling debt. Yet when Evelyn's relatives spoke of it, their voices brimmed with admiration. Such sacrifice, one of them told me, as if pawning a trinket to fix his own mistakes was on par with working double shifts to keep a roof over your child's head. The hypocrisy reached its peak just a year ago when Evelyn and Derek began planning their wedding. They wanted a venue that charged more per plate than I spent on a month of food, flowers imported from another continent, and a live band whose fee could have bought me a new car. Their credit cards were already close to their limits, Derek's investment ventures were producing nothing but excuses, and yet they came to me with a straight face and asked me to co-sign an $80,000 0-cent loan. "It will be an investment in my dream," Evelyn said, her eyes bright but hard. When I refused because I had seen the late payment notices, because I knew they were teetering on the edge of financial collapse, she didn't argue. She just went very still, the way she had all those years ago, and said in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, "You've always been a dream killer, Mom." The words spread through the family like spilled wine, staining everything they touched. By Christmas, I was the mother who would not help her own daughter, the cold woman who had denied her only child the wedding she deserved. No one mentioned the unpaid bills, the maxed-out cards, the risk of losing my own home if they defaulted. They did not want to hear it. Evelyn had given them a simpler story, one they could repeat over holiday dinners and in phone calls with relatives. I was jealous, I was stingy, and I had been that way all her life. In her world, Derek's reckless spending was living fully. His gambling debts, lessons learned, his fake watch a noble sacrifice. My caution, my refusal to dig myself into a hole to fund her fantasy, was a personal attack. The scales were tilted so far I no longer recognized the balance. I learned to keep my answers short when the subject came up, to let the accusations pass over me like cold wind. But I kept every word she had said tucked away, every look, every shrug when someone else repeated the lie. I knew they were weaving a story where I was the villain. I also knew that stories have a way of changing when the ending comes from a place they never expected. The wind around the cabin never really stopped in winter. It slid through the pine trees and pressed itself against the walls, finding the smallest gaps in the old wood to whistle through. At night it rattled the loose pane in the kitchen window and made the beams creak like an old ship. The smell inside was the scent of my life, aged pine, damp from snowmelt, and the faint trace of cedar from the chest where I kept my few good linens. On the wall above the dining table hung a clock that had been my husband's pride. It had been running a little slow ever since the day he died, and no matter how many times I adjusted it, it always fell behind, as though it too no longer saw the point in keeping up. This cabin had been in my family for 3 generations. My father had built the front porch himself, hammering nails with a rhythm I could still remember if I closed my eyes. The roof leaked in the spring, the stove needed coaxing to light, and the floorboards dipped in odd places, but it was mine. I kept it warm as best I could, stacking logs by the stove and mending the curtains when the edges frayed. I liked to think of it as stubborn rather than falling apart, like me. When Evelyn's daughter, my only grandchild, turned 6, I spent weeks sewing her a quilt. I pieced it together from soft cotton in shades of rose and cream, the kind that would warm her without being too heavy for a child. I tucked a little note in the package. Made with love from Grandma. A week later, the package came back. The box was unopened, but taped to the top was a yellow sticky note, written in Evelyn's neat, slanted handwriting. We don't take old junk. I stood at the kitchen counter with the box under my hands, staring at the note until the words blurred. It was the only time I can remember sitting down on the cold floor and staying there long after the light outside had gone. I began to wonder how much of their care for me was obligation, how much was performance. So one evening, when Evelyn called to ask something trivial about her old school records, I mentioned casually that the cabin's chimney had started to crack and lean. The inspector says it might fall this winter if I don't get it fixed, I told her. She made a small, polite sound, the kind you make when someone tells you the weather forecast. No offer of help, no suggestion that she might visit. A week later, I told the same story to my sister and then to a cousin. The responses were the same. Concerned murmurs, quickly followed by changes of subject. No one asked if I was managing. No one asked if I was warm enough. The truth was, I was fine. I had enough wood to last the season, enough savings to patch the chimney if I needed to, but I wanted to know if anyone would step forward without being asked outright. I learned my answer quickly, and yet, even after all the cold shoulders, there were lines I would not cross. Derek's mother had been in poor health for years, living alone in a small apartment in the city. I had met her only twice, but I could see in her the same quiet dignity I recognized in my own mother. When I overheard Derek one night at a family dinner complaining about the cost of her treatment, rolling his eyes as if she were a bill that would not go away, I made my decision. A week later, I transferred money anonymously to her hospital account. I told no one. It was not for thanks or for leverage. It was simply what you did when you knew someone was suffering, even if their own children didn't see the value in helping them. The days in the cabin were long and quiet. I read in the mornings by the stove, my fingers tracing the edges of books I had read so many times I could recite the endings. In the afternoons, I mended clothes or baked bread, letting the scent fill the small rooms. Evenings were the hardest, when the shadows lengthened and the silence pressed closer. That was when the absence of voices became a weight. No one to share tea with, no one to ask how my day had been. The phone calls from Evelyn were short, often requests for documents or small favors, never questions about my well-being. I told myself I didn't mind, that solitude was easier than the sting of being dismissed. But some nights, when the wind howled against the cabin and the clock ticked slow on the wall, I thought about that returned package, the sticky note in her handwriting, and the way my hands had shaken when I peeled it off the box. I thought about how family could look right through you as if you were part of the furniture, only noticing when they wanted something. And in those moments, I began to understand that my quiet was not weakness. It was the place where I kept the truth, waiting for the day it would be needed. The storm came in fast, faster than the weatherman had warned. By late afternoon, the wind had turned sharp enough to cut through my coat when I stepped out to bring in the last of the firewood. Snow swirled sideways, piling against the door, as if trying to push its way in. The sky had gone the color of slate, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice. When the lights flickered once, twice, then died altogether, the cabin fell into a silence that felt heavier than the storm outside. I lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table, its glow barely enough to reach the corners of the room. The woodpile inside was down to 3 small logs. I had been saving them for the coldest nights, but the storm made that night colder by the minute. I fed one into the stove and watched the flames catch, willing them to last. By early evening, the fire had burned low again. I went to the shed for more, only to find the rack empty. The last delivery had been delayed because the main road was iced over. Without electricity, there was no heater to fall back on, just the walls of the cabin and the blanket around my shoulders. The cold seeped into my bones slowly, then all at once. My fingers stiffened, my breath fogged in front of me. I tried warming my hands with a mug of tea, but the water cooled before I could finish it. By the time the oil lamp began to dim, I knew I could not get through the night alone. I stood by the phone for a long moment before picking it up. The line crackled faintly, but the connection held. "Sweetheart," I said when Evelyn answered, my voice softer than I intended. "I'm freezing. I don't think I can last the night." There was a pause, a faint rustle as if she were shifting the phone to her other ear. "Hold on," she said, her tone clipped. I could hear voices in the background, music, laughter. Then Derek's voice replaced hers. "Then freeze," he said, his voice flat and almost bored. "Saves us the funeral cost." The line went dead. For a moment I just stood there with the receiver in my hand, listening to the empty hum on the other end. Then I set it down gently, as if the way I handled it might change what had just happened. The cold seemed to press in harder after that, as though the walls themselves had heard him. I went back to the stove and sat down in front of it, though it was only warm from the ashes now. My hands found the wedding dress on the chair beside me. I pulled it into my lap, letting the fabric spill over my knees. The lace was cool against my palms, the same way it had been the night Evelyn had stepped on it. My fingers traced the seam I had mended after that, the tiny stitches almost invisible in the dim light. The weight of the dress brought back another winter, many years ago, when my husband was still alive. That year the snow had been nearly as heavy, the wind just as cruel. The chimney had cracked and the fire would not hold. We had only one good blanket between us, thick and worn but warm enough if we stayed close. I remembered the way he had wrapped it around my shoulders first, then pulled me against him so we could share the heat. I remembered the sound of his breathing slowing as he fell asleep, and how I had stayed awake listening to the storm, feeling safe simply because he was there. Now, there was no one to wrap the blanket, no one to reach for in the dark. Just me, the dress, and the slow creep of cold through the cabin. I sat there until my legs went numb, until the lamp flickered low and shadows stretched across the walls. Outside the wind howled like something alive, and I knew that no one was coming. Not tonight. Not ever. Unless they needed something. I pulled the dress closer and closed my eyes, letting the sound of the storm fill the room. If this was what it meant to be forgotten, I would remember it well. The storm passed 2 days later, leaving the world outside buried under a crust of snow so thick it glittered under the pale sun. The air inside the cabin was still sharp with cold, so I moved slowly, conserving the little warmth my body held. I went to the cedar chest in my bedroom to look for the heavy wool blanket my mother had given me decades ago. The chest had belonged to my parents, and it had sat at the foot of their bed for as long as I could remember. Its brass hinges groaned when I lifted the lid, releasing a breath of air, scented faintly with cedar and thyme. Under the folded quilts and layers of linen, my hand brushed against something hard and flat. I pulled it out, a leather-bound portfolio, worn at the edges, the kind my father used to carry to town when he had important papers to sign. Inside were yellowed deeds, hand-drawn maps, and, tucked in the back, a letter written in my father's careful, deliberate handwriting. The date at the top was from the years just after the war. "Rosalind," it began. He was one of the only people who ever called me by my full name. "If you are reading this, it means the land is still in our family. When the surveyors came through in '46, they spoke of veins in the rock beneath our hill. Silver, they said, but too costly to reach at the time. If times turn hard, remember what lies under your feet." For years I had thought of that land as a quiet insurance policy, something I would one day sell to give Evelyn a start in life, a gift she would never see coming, a safety net disguised as a windfall. But standing there with the brittle paper in my hands, I realized that future had already been decided the night she ground her heel into my wedding dress. My father had been a man of few words, and seeing them on the page made my chest tighten. I traced the map with my fingertips. The ink faded, but clear enough to follow. The old coordinates were scrawled in the margins, leading to a shaded section under where my cabin now stood. Whatever lay beneath that hill no longer belonged to the vision I once had for her. The next morning, I wrapped the portfolio in brown paper and walked it down the icy road to the small office that served as our county's land records department. The clerk behind the counter was a man well into his 60s, his hair gone completely silver. He adjusted his glasses as I laid the map and letter before him. "This is quite a find," he murmured, leaning closer. His finger followed the lines on the map, and his brows lifted. "You know what you've got here? These are preliminary mineral surveys from right after the war. Most folks don't even realize they were done in this county." He looked up at me then, and I could see the spark of interest in his eyes. "If you want my advice, you should talk to a mining company before showing this to anyone else." His words stayed with me all the way home. That night, I sat by the stove with the documents spread across my lap. I thought about the dress in my bedroom, the torn lace mended with tiny stitches, the phone call in the storm, the note on the returned package. I thought about the way Evelyn had looked at me in that restaurant, her heel grinding into the work of my hands. I spent several days quietly verifying the documents with a trusted attorney in town, someone who had handled mineral rights cases before. He confirmed my father's survey matched current geological records and suggested a few companies that could move quickly while keeping my name out of the public eye. Within a week, I had reached out to a reputable mining company whose name I knew from local news stories. They sent a small team to assess the property. I stayed inside the cabin while they worked, watching through the frosted window as they marked the snow with bright flags and drove a drill into the frozen ground. 2 days later, their representative sat at my kitchen table with a leather briefcase at his feet and a smile that did not need practice. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, sliding a paper toward me, "we have confirmed significant silver deposits under your property. Based on the projected yield, we are prepared to offer you $200 million for the mineral rights." $200 million? The number seemed unreal, like a joke whispered in the wrong room. My hands stayed folded on the table. "I'll need some time to get my affairs in order," I told him. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he nodded, closing the briefcase. "Of course. We can give you 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Enough time to decide exactly how this would change things and who would feel it most. That weekend, I was invited, more likely tolerated, at a small gathering Evelyn and Derek were hosting at their house. I brought a gift for my granddaughter, a small wooden chest my father had carved himself, its lid inlaid with a delicate pattern of leaves and flowers. I had polished it until the grain glowed. When I handed it to the child, Evelyn took it instead, flipping the lid open and shut before letting out a laugh sharp enough to draw the room's attention. "You can't keep giving us your attic garbage, Mom," she said, her voice bright but edged. Derek, leaning in the doorway with a drink in his hand, smirked. "Maybe she can burn it for heat." The laughter that followed was easy and unguarded. No one looked at me except my granddaughter, who seemed unsure whether she was allowed to touch the chest anymore. I stood there for a moment, letting the words settle like snow on stone. Then I smiled faintly, as if I had not heard them at all. In truth, I had heard every syllable, and I knew they would serve me well in the days to come. When the mining company's wire transfer cleared, it came in quiet, just numbers on a screen. Though enough to buy a small town, I stared at it for a long time, the way you might look at a door you never thought you'd open. Then I got to work. The first thing I did was make it disappear, at least to anyone looking in from the outside. I set up 3 separate companies under names with no connection to mine, each one managed by a trustee whose loyalty I could count on. From there, I funneled the money into a web of trusts and investment accounts, each insulated from the others. On paper, I was still the same woman, living in a weathered cabin in the mountains. In reality, I now had the means to change the shape of someone else's world. The first shape I changed was the one surrounding Evelyn and Derek's home. Their street was lined with tidy houses, manicured lawns, and the kind of neighbors who smiled too widely. Over the next 2 weeks, one of my companies quietly purchased the empty lots and rental properties within walking distance of their house. No one noticed. People don't look too closely when the buyer's name is something bland like Westview Holdings, LLC. Then I turned my attention to the crown jewel of their plans, the wedding venue. It was a sprawling estate on the edge of the county, with ivy climbing its stone walls and a ballroom that smelled faintly of polished wood and roses. Evelyn had been telling everyone about it for months. They had made a hefty deposit, but hadn't yet paid the balance. a detail I learned from a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. Through one of my companies, I bought a controlling interest in the holding company that owned the property. Still, I didn't move yet. There was a better way. Closing it through a tax lien meant the shutdown would appear as a routine matter of unpaid taxes, not the deliberate act of a new owner. That way, no one, not even Evelyn, could trace the decision back to me. A review of county records revealed something the venue's owners probably hoped no one would notice: unpaid property taxes. The debt wasn't enormous by my new standards, but it was enough to trigger a tax lien. In this state, a lien holder could force a sale or take possession if the debt remained unpaid. I bought the lien outright, and with it the legal right to demand settlement. The timing had to be perfect. Too soon and they might scrape together a solution. Too late and the satisfaction would be diluted. I waited until 4 days before the wedding. With the help of my lawyer and a former county official I once knew, I was able to fast-track the lien enforcement process, something that would normally take weeks, so the closure order would land precisely when they were most vulnerable. That morning, the county office issued a formal notice. The property was being closed, effective immediately, for failure to resolve outstanding tax obligations. The order was delivered by courier to the venue and emailed to every upcoming client, including one, Evelyn Hayes. I wasn't there to see her open the email, but I can picture it. Her manicured hand gripping the phone, the color draining from her face as she read the words, Derek pacing behind her, swearing under his breath, calculating how much cash they could beg, borrow, or steal in 72 hours. They called the venue manager, they called their wedding planner, they called anyone who might have a spare ballroom hidden away. Every location within 100 miles was either booked solid or unwilling to slash through the red tape that came with such short notice. By the second day, desperation had set in. I heard from a cousin, one of the same people who'd once scolded me at Thanksgiving, that Evelyn had been on the phone for hours, her voice breaking, asking if anyone had a barn, a backyard, anything that could hold 200 guests. No one offered. By the third day, they had stopped trying. The flowers had been ordered, the dress, not mine, fitted, the guests ready to travel, but the place where it was all supposed to happen had been locked and shuttered by order of the county. I imagined the ballroom standing empty, the polished floors catching sunlight that no one would dance in. I didn't need to see the chaos firsthand to know how it unfolded. I knew my daughter well enough to understand the particular humiliation of having to call her friends, her vendors, her photographer, and tell them it was over. I knew Derek well enough to guess that his first instinct would be to blame her, even if he'd been the one to insist on the venue they couldn't afford. And I knew, as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, that this was only the beginning. The wedding was gone, but I still had one more card to play. The headline broke before sunrise. Lavish wedding canceled over unpaid taxes. It was splashed across the local news site, accompanied by a glossy photo of the venue's ivy-covered walls, taken back when it was still open for business, and a grainy shot of Evelyn and Derek from a charity gala, champagne glasses raised. The article made no mention of me, but it didn't have to. By mid-morning, the story had spread across every neighborhood Facebook group and coffee shop in town. People who had once envied Evelyn's social media posts were now laughing into their lattes. They lived like royalty but couldn't pay taxes. Guess the princess forgot about the IRS. The gossip was a wildfire, and I didn't have to light a single match. I heard from a cousin that Evelyn had locked herself in her bedroom the first day, only emerging to make frantic phone calls. By the second day, the panic had softened into something colder. Shame. Derek apparently had been pacing like a caged animal, snapping at anyone who dared to speak to him. Their guest list had become their jury, and every whispered comment on the canceled wedding was another verdict against them. On the third day, there was a knock at my cabin door. The sound carried strangely in the cold air, too hesitant to be the wind. I opened it to find Evelyn standing there in a designer coat, her hair still perfect, but her eyes rimmed red. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. She just stepped inside, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. "Mom?" Her voice wavered, and she reached for the performance she thought might still work on me. "Please, help me. We can fix this. If you just lend me the money, I'll pay you back. I promise." I studied her for a long moment, then let my hand rest on the silk bundle in my lap, the wedding dress I had sewn, wrapped in my mother's scarf. I smoothed the fabric, feeling the scar her heel had left in the fabric. "You called it a rag," I said quietly. "Now it bought your silence." She blinked, her mouth parting as if to argue, but no words came. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the moment she realized that whatever she thought she knew about me had changed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The silence between us did the work for me. She left without another word. I watched her car disappear down the snowy road, knowing she would tell herself the story differently later. She always did. Derek's reckoning came more publicly. 2 weeks after the wedding imploded, news broke that the real estate investment firm he worked for had been acquired by a private equity group. The truth was, federal investigators had been circling Derek for months. My acquisition simply put me in a position to hand the right files to the right people at the right moment. The acquisition was swift, quiet, and absolute, engineered through one of the very companies I had built to shelter my mining fortune. At first, Derek seemed untouched. He told friends it was just a restructuring, that he'd keep his position, maybe even get a promotion. But I knew better. I had already met with the new board. I had already seen the files they'd been handed from a whistleblower inside his own office. 3 weeks after the takeover, federal agents walked through the glass doors of Derek's building. The photos hit the news within hours. Derek in his tailored suit, hands cuffed in front of him, flanked by 2 FBI agents. The charges were worse than I had imagined. Wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy. Buried in the indictment was a detail that made my coffee taste sweeter that morning. The lavish wedding that never happened had been part of his scheme, a lure to attract wealthy investors and women with trust funds, convincing them he was a man of stability and status. The story spread faster than the one about the canceled wedding. Now Derek wasn't just a man who couldn't pay his taxes, he was a criminal. Evelyn's friends, the ones who had laughed with her when she called my quilt old junk and my dress a rag, stopped returning her calls. Her social media went dark. I didn't feel joy in the way people expect when they imagine revenge. What I felt was quieter, heavier, like a balance that had finally settled after years of leaning too far to one side. And as I folded the silk scarf more tightly around the dress, I thought of my father's letter, his words about what lay beneath my feet. He had been right. It had saved me, and in its own way, it had finished what he'd started. After Derek's arrest, the walls of Evelyn's life crumbled faster than anyone expected. The divorce papers were filed within weeks, each page stamped with the urgency of someone trying to distance themselves from a sinking ship. But the stain of his crimes didn't wash off her name so easily. The friends who had once flocked to her parties and fought for a place on her guest list stopped returning her calls. Her invitations were ignored, her messages left unread. The carefully curated image she'd spent years building, the lavish dinners, the champagne brunches, the exotic vacations, collapsed into silence. Without Derek's schemes and the illusion of wealth, there was no one left to fund the lifestyle she'd worn like a crown. The people she'd thought of as friends had only ever been business partners in disguise, drawn to the scent of money. When that scent vanished, so did they. I heard from a neighbor in her neighborhood that she had sold her house quietly, the one with the manicured lawn and the expensive security system. The moving truck came at dawn, and by nightfall, the house was dark. I didn't ask where she went. Some things are better left to the wind. While her world was shrinking, mine was expanding. I bought a house near the ocean, with windows that opened to salt air and a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. From my kitchen window, I could see the horizon change color with the tide. The air was softer there, warmer, as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't leave the cabin empty, though. I kept it as it was, every beam, every knot in the wood, because some roots are worth preserving, even when you no longer live among them. With part of the money, I started a scholarship fund for older women who wanted to learn sewing, quilting, and tailoring. Too often, they were told it was too late for them to learn something new, too late to build a skill that might carry them forward. I knew better. The fund paid for classes, machines, fabrics, and even travel for women who had never been further than their own county. In the small studio I built above my garage, I displayed the wedding dress, not as a relic of what was taken from me, but as a symbol of what I could build when I refused to be broken. It sat on a mannequin in the corner, the silk catching the light that streamed through the window. I left the repaired seam visible, a deliberate choice. People asked why I didn't hide it, And I told them the truth. The strength was in the mending. A month after moving to the coast, I sent Evelyn a letter. Inside was a modest check, not enough to solve her problems, just enough to remind her that I could if I wanted to. The card with it was handwritten, my pen steady on the page. From the shack, with love. I didn't sign my name. She would know who it was from. In the evenings I sat by the window with the sea stretching out before me, the waves curling and breaking against the shore. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. On the table beside me the dress waited. Its hem pooled like water on the floor. One night I threaded a needle with fine white silk and began to work on the last unfinished seam. My hands moved slowly, each stitch small and sure. The sound of the ocean rose and fell outside, steady as breath. Sometimes silence is mistaken for surrender. But I had learned otherwise. Silence can be a loom, and patience is the thread. And when the time comes, the seam you stitch in quiet will hold longer than anything made in haste. As I tied off the last knot, I looked up at the horizon, the sky deepening into twilight. Sometimes, I said aloud to the empty room, silence stitches a stronger seam than words ever could. And that, my dear listeners, is how a lifetime of silence turned into the loudest answer I ever gave. If my story found its way into your heart, if it made you think of your own battles fought in quiet, then you understand. Revenge has no expiration date, and dignity never goes out of style. I have more truths to tell. Some are bittersweet, some will burn going down, but all of them are real. So if you don't want to miss the next one, make sure you subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Pull up a chair on my porch, and I'll keep the kettle warm. We're just getting started.